Long before anyone could remember his real name, people across the dusty frontier knew him only as El Apache. Some claimed he had earned the title because he fought with the speed and silence of a warrior. Others insisted it was because he disappeared into the mountains whenever soldiers came looking for him, leaving nothing behind but hoofprints that vanished in the wind. Whatever the truth, his name carried enough weight to silence an entire saloon. Conversations stopped when strangers whispered it, and parents warned their children not to wander too far from home after sunset, lest El Apache appear from the darkness. Stories about him spread from one village to another, growing larger with every retelling. In one version, he robbed wealthy landowners who had stolen from poor farmers. In another, he was a ruthless outlaw who spared no one who crossed him. Every storyteller added something new, a lightning-fast draw, impossible escapes, hidden treasure buried beneath the desert. The line between truth and legend had long since disappeared. Yet among all the tales, one rumor was repeated more than any other. Women supposedly adored El Apache. Tavern singers composed ballads about his handsome face, piercing eyes, and mysterious smile. Travelers swore they had seen noblewomen sneak away from lavish parties just to catch a glimpse of the famous outlaw. Others claimed widows, ranchers' daughters, and wealthy socialites alike dreamed of winning his heart. El Apache encouraged these stories without ever confirming or denying them. He understood that a legend was often more powerful than reality. If people believed he was irresistible, they hesitated to challenge him. Confidence became another weapon, as useful as the revolver hanging from his belt. He wore expensive leather boots polished despite endless rides through dusty trails, kept his black hat perfectly shaped, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who feared nothing. Whenever he entered a town, curious eyes followed him. Women noticed him, and men either admired or envied him. El Apache answered every glance with an easy grin that concealed far more than anyone realized. He flirted effortlessly, exchanged clever remarks, accepted invitations to dance, and disappeared before dawn. To outsiders, it seemed he lived exactly as the stories described, a man free from rules, responsibility, and emotional ties. Only El Apache knew the truth. Behind the carefully crafted image hid a loneliness that no amount of admiration could erase. He had never allowed himself to become truly close to another person. Every relationship remained shallow, ending before trust could take root. He always found a reason to leave, a new bounty, another dangerous journey, or simply the fear that staying too long would expose the vulnerable man beneath the legend. His fear had deep roots. Years earlier, when he was still a young ranch hand with ordinary dreams, he had believed promises made by someone he loved. That trust ended in betrayal, costing him not only his happiness but also his home and the peaceful life he had imagined. Since then, he convinced himself that love was little more than another trap. Affection faded, promises broke, and anyone who got close eventually became a weakness others could exploit. Instead of risking another heartbreak, El Apache built walls around himself. He transformed pain into confidence, silence into mystery, and insecurity into arrogance. Every smile became a carefully chosen mask. Every compliment he received only strengthened the illusion that people admired the legend rather than the man hidden beneath it. Late one evening, after leaving another lively cantina where music and laughter filled the air, El Apache rode alone beneath a sky crowded with stars. The cheers of strangers faded behind him, replaced by the endless whisper of desert winds. His horse walked steadily across the moonlit trail while the outlaw stared toward the distant mountains. For the first time in many years, the applause and admiration felt strangely empty. He realized he could remember countless faces but very few names. He had shared dances, drinks, and conversations with dozens of people, yet there was no one waiting for his return. The legend of El Apache had earned him respect, fear, and fame, but it had never brought him genuine companionship. As dawn slowly painted the horizon with shades of gold, El Apache continued riding toward the unknown. He believed he was simply searching for another hiding place from the law. In reality, fate was guiding him toward a quiet village where someone unlike anyone he had ever met would eventually challenge everything he believed about himself, and the legend he had spent years creating. After 3 days of riding beneath the scorching desert sun, El Apache reached a small village hidden between rolling hills and a winding river. Unlike the noisy frontier towns where gamblers, bounty hunters, and soldiers crowded the streets, this place seemed untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Whitewashed adobe homes lined narrow dirt roads, children laughed as they chased chickens through open yards, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from the village bakery each morning. It was exactly the kind of place where no one expected a notorious outlaw to appear. El Apache pulled the brim of his black hat low over his eyes as he rode into the village. He had come only to rest his horse, buy supplies, and disappear before anyone recognized him. That had always been his way. Stay long enough to recover, but never long enough to make connections. The villagers glanced at the stranger with cautious curiosity. His worn leather coat, polished boots, and silver revolver suggested he had lived a dangerous life. Yet no one greeted him with fear. Instead, they returned to their daily routines, treating him like any other traveler passing through. It felt unusual. He tied his horse outside the village stable before entering the only general store. Shelves of flour, coffee beans, dried meat, and handmade candles filled the modest building. Behind the counter stood an elderly shopkeeper who welcomed him with a warm smile instead of suspicion. "Long journey?" the old man asked. "Long enough," El Apache replied, placing a few coins on the counter for supplies. As the shopkeeper packed his purchases, the front door swung open. A young woman stepped inside carrying a basket filled with freshly picked herbs and wildflowers. Sunlight streamed through the doorway, illuminating her simple cream-colored dress and the loose braid that rested over one shoulder. She wasn't dressed like the wealthy women El Apache had met in bustling cities. There were no expensive jewels or elegant fabrics, only practical clothing suited for village life. Yet there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. She greeted the shopkeeper with a cheerful smile before noticing the stranger standing nearby. Their eyes met for only a moment. Unlike nearly everyone else who encountered El Apache, she showed no sign of surprise or admiration. She didn't blush. She didn't stare. She simply nodded politely, as one would acknowledge any traveler, before continuing toward the shelves. The reaction caught him off guard. Most people either feared him or found themselves intrigued by the mysterious outlaw. This young woman seemed entirely indifferent. Trying to recover his confidence, El Apache tipped his hat. "Good morning." She returned the greeting with a calm smile. "Good morning." Nothing more. No nervous laughter. No curious questions. No lingering glance. She selected a bag of flour, thanked the shopkeeper, paid for her items, and quietly left the store. El Apache watched the door close behind her. "Who's she?" he asked casually. The old shopkeeper chuckled. "Her name is Sophia. She was born here and has lived in this village all her life." "Sophia," El Apache repeated. "She's kind to everyone," the shopkeeper continued, "but she doesn't pay much attention to fancy reputations. Around here, a person's character matters more than the stories told about them." Those words lingered in El Apache's mind long after he left the store. Later that afternoon, he wandered through the village square where Sophia was helping several children gather fallen apples beneath a large tree. She laughed as one little boy proudly presented the smallest apple in the basket, praising him as though he had discovered hidden treasure. There was nothing artificial about her kindness. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply cared. As El Apache approached, one of the children accidentally dropped the basket, sending apples rolling across the dusty road. Without thinking, El Apache bent down and helped gather them. The children thanked him excitedly. Sophia looked at him with genuine appreciation. "Thank you," she said warmly. "You didn't have to help." "It wasn't much," he answered. She smiled. "I've learned that small kindnesses often mean the most." For reasons he couldn't explain, those simple words affected him more than compliments ever had. There was no flirtation in her voice. No attempt to flatter him. She wasn't speaking to the famous outlaw whose name echoed across the frontier. She was speaking to an ordinary man who had picked apples off the ground. As evening settled over the quiet village, Apache found himself lingering longer than he had planned. He told himself it was because his horse needed another night's rest. Deep down, however, he knew the truth. For the first time in years, someone had looked beyond the legend of Apache without even trying, and somehow, that simple act unsettled him more than facing an army of bounty hunters ever could. Apache had intended to leave the village the following morning. His saddlebags were packed, his horse was watered, and the eastern sky had only begun to brighten when he walked toward the stable. Yet, as he tightened the saddle straps, he found himself glancing toward the village square. Something, or rather, someone, made him hesitate. He shook his head with a quiet laugh. "What am I doing?" he muttered to himself. "I've stayed too long already." Before he could mount his horse, the elderly stable keeper approached. "If you're heading east," the old man said, "would you mind helping us?" A wagon carrying grain broke down on the river road. "It's too heavy for our older folks to move." Apache almost refused. Helping strangers had never been part of his plans. But after a moment's silence, he nodded. "Show me the way." The broken wagon sat beside the river, one wheel buried in soft mud. Several villagers were trying unsuccessfully to free it. Among them was Sophia, her sleeves rolled up as she pushed against the wagon with surprising determination. When she noticed Apache approaching, she offered him the same calm smile she always did. "I'm glad you came." No dramatic praise. No admiration. Just simple gratitude. Working together, the villagers managed to lift the wheel while Apache used a sturdy branch as a lever. After several exhausting minutes, the wagon finally lurched free. Cheers erupted from everyone nearby. The children celebrated as though a great battle had been won. Sophia laughed, brushing dirt from her hands. "I suppose even wagons can be stubborn." Apache smiled despite himself. "I've met worse." As the villagers returned home, Sophia remained by the river to wash the mud from her hands. Apache joined her, kneeling beside the flowing water. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "You don't seem impressed by famous outlaws." She glanced at him curiously. "Should I be? Most people are." She dipped her fingers into the cool water. "I don't know enough about you to be impressed." He leaned against a nearby rock. "You've heard the stories." "I've heard stories about many people." "And you don't believe them?" "I believe stories usually tell us what people want others to think." Her answer caught him off guard. "What do you think they hide?" "The truth." Apache laughed softly. "You're different." "So I've been told." He studied her face, searching for signs of fear or fascination. There were none. "You know," he said, "I've met women who crossed deserts just to meet me." Sophia raised an eyebrow. "That sounds exhausting." He blinked. "That's all you have to say?" She smiled. "If they crossed the desert, I hope they brought enough water." For the first time in years, someone had answered his boast with humor instead of admiration. He couldn't help laughing. The conversation continued as they walked back toward the village. "So," Sophia asked, "what exactly do you do?" "I'm an outlaw." "I know. I've escaped soldiers." "I'm sure you have." "I've won more gunfights than I can count." She nodded thoughtfully. "And what do you enjoy?" The question stopped him in his tracks. "What? What makes you happy?" He searched for an answer. "Riding? Winning? Being feared?" None of those seemed right anymore. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. Sophia looked at him with gentle understanding. "Then perhaps you've been too busy surviving to find out." Those words struck deeper than she could possibly know. For years, El Apache had measured his life by victories and escapes. He knew how to outshoot enemies, outride posses, and vanish into the wilderness. Yet he had never stopped to ask himself what kind of life he actually wanted. As they reached the village, children ran past them chasing a homemade wooden hoop. Sophia waved to them, and they waved back with joyful smiles. "They trust you," El Apache observed. "I've known most of them since they were born. You've never wanted to leave." She looked toward the distant mountains. "I've dreamed of seeing the world." "Then why stay?" "Because people matter more than places." That answer lingered in his mind long after they parted. That evening, El Apache sat alone outside the inn, watching the sun disappear behind the hills. The village was peaceful, filled with music, conversation, and the comforting sounds of ordinary life. For the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about his next escape. He was thinking about Sophia. She had challenged every mask he wore, not with anger or judgment, but with simple honesty. She never treated him as a legend, an outlaw, or a hero. She spoke to him as if he were simply another person trying to find his way. And that unsettled him more than any duel ever had. Without realizing it, the walls he had spent years building around his heart had begun to crack. One quiet conversation at a time. Days passed, and what was meant to be a single night stop became nearly a week. The villagers no longer looked at El Apache with cautious curiosity. They greeted him with friendly nods, invited him to share meals, and even trusted him with simple chores. It was a life so ordinary that it felt unfamiliar. Each morning, Sophia could be found helping wherever she was needed. Some days she assisted the elderly with their gardens. Other days she taught children to read beneath the shade of a large oak tree. She never sought praise, and she never expected anything in return. One afternoon, El Apache found her repairing a broken wooden fence beside the village orchard. "You know," he said with a grin, "I've escaped armed soldiers, crossed deserts, and survived more gunfights than I can count." Sophia glanced at the crooked fence and handed him a hammer. "Good." He looked at the tool in confusion. "Then fixing a fence should be easy." He laughed despite himself. "You always have an answer." "I usually have work," she replied with a smile. For the next hour, they worked side by side, replacing broken boards and driving nails into fresh timber. At first, El Apache complained about the heat, the splinters, and the stubborn wood. Sophia simply smiled and kept working. By the time they finished, both were covered in dust. "It doesn't look perfect," El Apache admitted. Sophia stepped back to admire their work. "No," she said. "But it's strong." As the sun began to set, they walked toward the river carrying their empty tools. The evening breeze cooled the air, and the water reflected the golden colors of the sky. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sophia broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Why do you always leave?" He looked away. "What makes you think I always leave?" "You never unpack your saddlebags." He smiled faintly. "You notice everything." "I try." He skipped a small stone across the river. "I've learned that staying in one place is dangerous." "Because of the law." He hesitated. "Not just the law." Sophia waited patiently. After a long silence, El Apache spoke again. "When I was younger, I believed people kept their promises." His voice had lost its usual confidence. "I trusted someone with everything I had." "What happened?" "They betrayed me." The words came quietly. "My family lost our ranch because of that betrayal. The woman I thought I'd spend my life with chose wealth over loyalty. She helped the very people who ruined us." He paused, staring at the flowing water. "I wasn't just left behind. I was made a fool." For years, he had buried those memories beneath pride and reputation. He had told countless stories about daring escapes and impossible victories, but he had never spoken about the day his heart was broken. Sophia listened without interrupting. I decided then, El Apache continued, that trusting people only gives them the chance to hurt you. So you became someone no one could reach. He nodded. It was easier. Easier. Safer. Sophia considered his answer before speaking. It may have protected you from pain. She looked into his eyes. But it also protected you from happiness. Those words settled heavily between them. El Apache had faced guns without fear. He had stared down dangerous men. Yet hearing that simple truth made him feel more exposed than ever before. I don't know how to be different, he admitted. You don't have to become a different person. She smiled gently. You only have to stop pretending you're someone you're not. For the first time in years, El Apache felt understood. Not admired. Not feared. Understood. As they returned to the village, dark clouds gathered over the distant mountains. A cool wind swept across the valley, carrying the promise of an approaching storm. Neither of them noticed three unfamiliar riders watching the village from a nearby ridge. The men wore long coats, carried rifles across their saddles, and studied El Apache with careful attention. One of them unfolded a worn wanted poster bearing the outlaw's face. There he is, the rider muttered. We finally found him. Far below, El Apache walked through the village beside Sophia, unaware that his peaceful refuge was about to become the most dangerous place he had ever known. The past he had tried so hard to outrun had finally caught up with him, and this time, he was no longer the only one at risk. The storm arrived before dawn. Heavy clouds rolled over the mountains, covering the sky in shades of gray. Rain fell steadily, turning the dusty roads into muddy trails. Most of the villagers remained indoors, believing the day would pass quietly. El Apache was the first to notice something was wrong. Standing beneath the porch of the inn, he spotted three riders approaching through the rain. Their horses moved slowly but with purpose, and each man carried a rifle across his saddle. Even from a distance, El Apache recognized the determined look of men who were hunting someone. They had found him. Without another thought, he hurried across the village toward Sophia's cottage. She had just stepped outside with a basket covered by a cloth to protect it from the rain. She smiled when she saw him. You're awake early. His expression told her immediately that something was wrong. You have to listen carefully, he said. Some men are coming. They're not travelers. Her smile faded. They're looking for you. He nodded. I don't want anyone here getting hurt because of me. Sophia looked past him toward the road where the riders were becoming clearer through the rain. You should leave. I will. He paused. But first, I need to make sure they'll follow me instead of staying here. Before Sophia could answer, the sound of galloping horses echoed through the village. The three bounty hunters entered the square and stopped in front of the inn. Their leader climbed down from his horse, pulling a weathered wanted poster from his coat. We're looking for El Apache, he announced loudly. Hand him over, and no one else gets involved. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. No one spoke. No one pointed. The elderly shopkeeper stepped forward. We don't know anyone by that name. The bounty hunter narrowed his eyes. Don't lie to me. He grabbed the old man by the collar. Before anyone could react, El Apache stepped into the square. Let him go. Every eye turned toward him. The bounty hunter smiled. There you are. He released the shopkeeper, who stumbled backward. I was beginning to think you'd run. El Apache removed his revolver slowly but kept its barrel pointed toward the ground. You want me? That's right. Then leave these people out of it. The bounty hunter laughed. That depends on whether you cooperate. Sophia stepped forward despite the danger. No. El Apache glanced at her. Go back. I'm not leaving you. You have to. The leader raised his rifle. Touching. El Apache made his decision in that instant. He slipped his revolver back into its holster and raised both hands. "I'll come with you." The villagers stared in disbelief. The fearless outlaw who had spent years escaping capture was surrendering without firing a single shot. The bounty hunter seemed equally surprised. "That's unlike the stories." El Apache answered calmly. "The stories aren't always true." As two hunters approached to tie his hands, Sophia suddenly stepped between them. "You can't take him." One of the hunters reached for her arm, but El Apache moved first. He shoved the man backward, not with his gun, but with enough force to protect her. The movement sparked chaos. A rifle discharged into the air. Horses reared in panic. Villagers scattered for cover. Taking advantage of the confusion, El Apache drew his revolver and fired once, not at a person, but at the rope hanging the village bell. The bell crashed to the ground, startling the hunters' horses. The frightened animals bolted in different directions, throwing one rider into the muddy street. The villagers rushed to help one another while the remaining bounty hunters struggled to regain control. "Run!" El Apache shouted. Instead of fleeing alone, he turned back toward the village. An elderly woman had fallen near the well, unable to stand. Ignoring the danger, El Apache sprinted through the rain, lifted her to her feet, and carried her to safety. He then helped a frightened child reunite with his parents before facing the bounty hunters once more. Watching from the church steps, Sophia realized something profound. The man standing in the rain was nothing like the ruthless outlaw described in countless stories. He wasn't fighting to save himself. He was risking his freedom, and perhaps his life, to protect people who had shown him kindness. Eventually, the bounty hunters retreated, deciding that capturing El Apache was no longer worth the growing resistance of the united villagers and the confusion caused by the storm. As silence slowly returned, El Apache stood alone in the muddy square, exhausted and soaked by the rain. Sophia walked toward him without hesitation. "You stayed," she said softly. He looked at the villagers surrounding them. "I spent years believing the only person worth saving was myself." He lowered his head. "I was wrong." For the first time since becoming El Apache, he understood that real courage wasn't measured by how many enemies a man could defeat. It was measured by what, and who, he was willing to protect. The morning after the storm was unlike any other. Sunlight broke through the last of the clouds, bathing the village in a warm golden glow. The muddy streets slowly dried beneath the rising sun, and the sound of birds replaced the echoes of gunfire that had filled the square the previous day. Villagers emerged from their homes, repairing fences, clearing broken branches, and helping one another return to their ordinary routines. El Apache stood alone near the edge of the village, his horse saddled and ready for the road. He knew it was time to leave. The bounty hunters had retreated, but they would return someday, perhaps with more men. As long as he remained, the village would never truly be safe. He rested a hand on his horse's neck and looked back one last time. During the past week, this quiet place had given him something he had not known in years: peace. Footsteps approached behind him. "You weren't going to leave without saying goodbye, were you?" El Apache turned and saw Sophia walking toward him. The morning breeze gently stirred her hair, and the same calm smile he had come to admire rested on her face. "I thought it would be easier," he admitted. "For whom?" He had no answer. They stood together in silence for a moment, watching the villagers begin their day. "I've spent years running," El Apache said quietly. "Every town, every campfire, every road ended the same way. I arrived alone, and I left alone. And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now leaving doesn't feel so easy." Sophia looked at him thoughtfully. "That's because this place became more than a hiding place." He nodded. "It became a home." The word surprised even him. For years he had believed he no longer deserved a home. Sophia stepped closer. "When I first met you, everyone talked about the famous outlaw called El Apache." She smiled gently. "But after all this time, I don't think I've ever really met him." He looked at her in confusion. You haven't? No. I met a man who helped children pick up apples without expecting praise. She continued. A man who repaired fences, protected strangers, admitted his mistakes, and risked his life for people he barely knew. She reached out and took his hand. Legends don't do those things. People do. For a long moment, Apache could not speak. He had spent years hiding behind the name the world had given him. The fearless outlaw. The mysterious gunslinger. The man who trusted no one. Yet Sophia had seen beyond every story. She had found the person he thought had disappeared long ago. I don't even remember who I was before all this, he whispered. You don't have to become the man you were, Sophia replied. You only have to choose the man you want to be. Those words settled deep within his heart. He slowly removed the weathered wanted poster he had taken from one of the bounty hunters the previous day. Looking at the faded drawing of himself, he saw only a stranger, a man driven by anger, pride, and loneliness. Without hesitation, he folded the poster in half, then tore it into small pieces. The wind carried the fragments across the open field until they disappeared. The legend of Apache no longer needed to define him. As they walked back toward the village, the townspeople gathered to thank him. The elderly shopkeeper shook his hand with pride. The stable keeper promised there would always be a horse waiting if he ever returned. Children ran around him laughing, no longer seeing a feared outlaw but a trusted friend. Apache looked around at the smiling faces. For the first time in many years, he felt he belonged somewhere. He turned to Sophia. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. She smiled. Neither do I. But whatever comes next. He reached for her hand once more. I'd rather face it with someone beside me than spend another day hiding alone. Sophia squeezed his hand warmly. Then we'll face it together. As the sun climbed higher over the valley, the two of them walked side by side toward the village, not as an outlaw and a stranger, but as two people who had chosen hope over fear, trust over loneliness, and a future free from the shadows of the past. And though the frontier would always remember the legend of Apache, the village would remember something far greater. Not the outlaw who arrived wearing a famous name, but the man who left it behind.